Again, good morning, everyone. I'm Anthony Cervini. I'm a principal and head up our local government audit practice here at Sikich. Excited to have you. Honored to welcome you to day one of our 2026 Higher Education Forum. Been doing the Higher Education Forum for several years. This is your first time joining us. We're glad you're here. If you're joining us for return visitor here, we're excited to have you as well. A little bit of background on who we are here at Sikich. We're a professional services firm specializing in consulting, technology, and compliance services here. Our teams are all comprised of highly specialized, hands-on industry experts, work with organizations of all different types and sizes to help them achieve success. And then success can come in a lot of different ways, whether that be from an assurance standpoint, control standpoint, whatever technology standpoint. You name it, we probably do it here at Sikich. So again, we're excited to have you here, whether it's based at our corporate headquarters in Chicagoland or any of our folks scattered across the United States or across the globe. We have over 2,000 personnel ready and willing to serve you and help you in any way that we can as part of that. A few housekeeping items here on our next slide for you just before we get started today. If you are interested in receiving CPE credit for today's sessions, there will be a total of 7 polling questions throughout the 2 sessions that we're going through. You need to answer those in order to qualify for CPE. All certificates will then be sent via email to the email address that you use to register for the forum. Now, we got 2 great sessions to kick off things today. First, we're going to talk about IT controls and IT general controls in higher education. Steve Randall and Earl Peugeot are going to talk through that. Then after a short break, Matt Gears is going to come back and give you a few minutes to get your dance shoes on here. And we're going to cover the single audit shuffle and talk through some 25 and 26 changes that we saw with the compliance supplement and give you some updated information on the single audit process there. Again, if you do have any questions throughout the day, we encourage you to utilize the chat functions to submit those questions during the sessions. If we have time, we have the ability to answer those questions during the sessions. We will try our best to do so. However, if we don't get to your question, don't fret. We will send out a follow-up correspondence with any questions that we're not able to get to during the sessions. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn things over to Steve and Earl to talk about IT general controls. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks, Anthony. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning. As Anthony said, I'm Steve Randall. I lead Sikich's corporate governance, risk management, and compliance practice. I'm joined, as Anthony said, by Earl Peugeot, who leads our IT audit work that we do with higher education institutions. Today, we're going to talk about IT general controls, what they are, why they matter to finance leaders, and how they form the foundation for compliance, audit readiness, and institutional trust. For those of you who don't know me, I've done these presentations before. As I said, I'm a principal within the firm. I live in Chicago. I've been here, 35 years now. I'm originally from Ohio, attended Ohio State, moved to Illinois, got an MBA at Lewis University here. In total, I got obviously well over 30 years of experience. The last 26 of them have been dedicated to this profession, which is the corporate governance, risk management, and compliance. Our practice includes various internal control and risk management services, including internal audit, controls consulting, IT audit, IT compliance, among many, many others. The work affords me the opportunity to collaborate with very talented people like Anthony and Earl, while serving and advising phenomenal organizations like yours and the people they employ. I'm driving this, so any hiccups, you can blame me. This presentation, hiccups, you can blame me like we've had already. I look forward to the presentation, though, and welcome your questions and feedback. Earl?
Hi, I'm Earl Peugeot, and I do IT audits for Sikich. I have got a long experience in doing IT general controls and auditing. I just was actually, when they asked me to do give you a bio, I looked back and said, I started this in 1981. So I've got now 45 years worth of experience in IT audit, IT governance, risk, and compliance at various levels, mostly within the Fortune 100 companies out there. I cross boundaries. I know pharmacy, pharmacy retail, pharmaceutical, healthcare manufacturing, insurance, you name it. I've probably dabbled in it before. I've been currently working with a lot of different colleges and universities and having a great time doing it. So that kind of gives you the breadth of my experience with at a leadership level, and I'm happy to share my knowledge with you. My name looks strange to you. It is Belgian. Don't call me French, which means I have in my DNA an affinity for beer, chocolate, and bicycle road racing. So it's a little bit about me. I'll turn it over to Steve so that we can kick this off. We got a lot to go through this morning. I looked at it and said, I have to do this in an hour, you know? And then he said, yeah, you got to do it in an hour. So we're going to be speedy once I get going. So Steve, I'll let you take it away and give us the preamble.
Awesome. Thanks, Earl. And, you know, another thing coming out of Belgium, specifically Antwerp, you've got diamonds. All right, so I understand most of us in this session are finance leaders. My assumption coming in, since the higher education forum, we're all going to be higher ed finance leaders, but turns out quite a few of you are in sectors not outside of higher ed, so welcome. Hopefully this is valuable for you as well. My goal this morning is not turn any one of us into IT experts. Instead, we want to help you understand the things that are listed on this page, why IT controls matter to finance and accounting. We're going to describe the 5 core IT GC domains at a practical level. Earl's going to talk about how IT GCs connect directly to GLBA requirements. And lastly, we hope to present what some realistic scalable improvements look like in higher education. Should you have any questions, we'll try to leave time at the end to answer those. As Earl said, we've got a lot of content to go through, and here we go. I promise not to read slides to you this morning because I think that is really boring, but I'm going to do it this one time. Educational institutions have become increasingly attractive targets for cyber attackers, seeking access to valuable personal and financial information stored in student records and administrative systems. Examples are too numerous to list. If you just type university IT access breach into any search engine and click on the recent news, as I did last night, there are a few examples that'll be popping up on the screen, and they can be pretty scary. ITGCs are the first line of defense against cyber risk. Exposure due to poor ITGCs can come from multiple areas, such as poorly managed user access, including not disabling access on a timely basis or granting too much access to someone. It could be weak password practices. Your password policy must evolve to stay ahead of the threats. Or there could be inadequate monitoring of system activity. You have to make sure that suspicious activity is detected and responded to. And how about system changes? You want to be sure that system changes don't introduce vulnerabilities. Or you may have unclear security ownership and governance. Security expectations should be defined and enforced. Well, that you may be saying that's great for IT management, but cybersecurity events don't stop at IT. They trigger GLBA, FERPA, and state notification requirements. They create audit and compliance findings, which we're going to get into in great detail. They can jeopardize funding and insurance coverage, and they damage public trust and board confidence. And cybersecurity incidents rarely start with sophisticated attacks. They start with weak IT general controls. I believe everyone on this call has become increasingly dependent on technology to run our core operations and produce financial information. Nearly every key number used in finance leadership today is system generated. When those systems fail or when the controls around them are weak, the impact isn't limited to IT, as I just showed. It shows up in financial reporting, audit findings, regulatory compliance issues, funding eligibility, and ultimately your institution's reputation. IT general controls are what make these systems trustworthy. They ensure that the right people have access, changes are made appropriately, data is processed completely and accurately, and issues are detected and addressed. Without strong IT GCs, the auditors and the regulators, and your leadership cannot rely on the data, even if the systems themselves appear to be functioning. For example, if user access isn't well controlled, your auditors may determine they can't rely on system-generated financial reports, forcing them to complete expanded testing, can do manual reconciliations, and added scrutiny during their audit. Auditor reliance on effective ITGs continues to increase every year. Earl mentioned it a little bit in his intro. He's worked with more colleges and universities this year than he did last year. And he worked with more last year than he did the year prior. The lack of ITGCs increases cost, effort, and risk, so it's important that we get them right. So what happens when user access controls fails? Here's an example most of you can relate to, I think. Obviously, a university relies on its ERP system to generate financial reports used for monthly close and year-end reporting. And typically, user access is provisioned by IT. Oftentimes, it's done manually. Over time, several employees who changed roles or left the institution retain access to post journal entries and modify vendor master data. Obviously, this is not acceptable, and unfortunately, I've seen it in numerous places. One specific situation was a controller went on an extended summer vacation one year, and I must say it was a very well-deserved extended vacation. So in his absence, the institute granted the controllers access to a subordinate. But when the controller returned a couple of weeks later, IT neglected to revoke the subordinate's access for 3 years. Periodic access reviews should be in place to catch this, but sometimes these reviews are informal and inconsistently performed. In this case, they weren't performed at all. And even if no inappropriate activity is identified, and in my example, there wasn't, there will still be significant impact, including the items that you hopefully have read on this page. All right, we hear these statements all the time. Our systems are hosted, so controls are covered. We rely on SOC reports, or IT handles security. Each of these may be partially true, but none of them remove the institution's responsibility for effective controls, governance, and oversight. When institutions assume that hosted systems, vendor SOC reports, or IT ownership fully address control requirements, risk quietly shifts rather than disappears. Responsibility remains with your institution even when technology is outsourced. And going back to an earlier comment I made about the attendance here, this applies to you in higher ed or you in industry. For example, a vendor may be responsible for infrastructure security, but your institution still controls who has access, how roles are assigned, how changes are approved, and how exceptions are monitored. If those governance decisions aren't clearly defined and enforced, gaps emerge between what your institution assumes is covered and what's actually being controlled. These assumptions tend to create blind spots. The controls may exist, but they're undocumented, inconsistently applied, or not aligned with financial reporting and compliance needs. Over time, this leads to control breakdowns being discovered reactively. Maybe during an audit, possibly during a compliance review, or God forbid, an incident that we saw at the very beginning, rather than proactively through governance and oversight. At a high level, IT controls are the policies, procedures, and activities that ensure systems operate reliably, securely, and as intended over time. They establish the rules around who can access systems, how changes are made, how the data is processed, and how issues are identified and addressed. IT general controls don't process transactions themselves, but they determine whether the automated controls and system-generated reports can be trusted. In other words, they answer a critical question for finance leaders and auditors. Can we rely on what the system is telling us? This is where the link to financial reporting becomes very real. Financial statements, close processes, journal entries, reconciliations, and regulatory reporting all depend on data produced by systems. If access is too broad, changes aren't controlled, or system activity isn't monitored, confidence in that data erodes, again, even if there's no errors identified. So what I recommend is we think of ITGCs as the foundation between automated financial control. When the foundation is solid, auditors can rely on system outputs and automated controls. When it's not, reliance shifts back to manual reviews, expanded testing, and compensating controls, placing more burden on finance teams and ultimately increasing the audit risk. From an audit perspective, strong IT controls are what allows us to place reliance on system-generated data. When ITGCs are designed and operating effectively, we auditors can gain comfort that data flowing into the general ledger is complete, accurate, and appropriately restricted. When ITGCs are weak or inconsistently applied, auditors don't assume the data is wrong, but they also can't assume it's right. To manage that uncertainty, we compensate by expanding substantive testing, increasing manual procedures, and performing calculations that would otherwise be automated. The practical impact of this shows up quickly for finance teams. Audits take longer, requests increase, timelines tighten, and management is often asked to implement short-term compensating controls. Over time, this creates audit fatigue and higher costs, not because of transaction errors, but because the control foundation doesn't support reliance. And the little thing at the bottom of the page, auditors test less when they test more when they trust less.
You know, after your wonderful setup based on the need for IT general controls, I can just say, well, that's all, folks, and well, you know, and you've got the in a nutshell. But I'm going to take you one level deeper than Steve, is that we're going to talk about in rather somewhat gory details the ITGCs themselves. So I'm an auditor. I audit every day. I'm just not managing. I'm auditing. I'm hands-on. I love being hands-on. It's my, it's my affliction, if you want to call it, if anything. And I want to talk about the 5 core ITGC domains. So yes, folks, you're getting this right off my audit program. In case you want to know, this is the cheat sheet to looking at ITGCs. So the first thing and the most important thing, if you do nothing else and if you take nothing away, it's risk management. You can't get into access or change or backup or operations until you've done a very good risk assessment of your environment. Know what your risks are and how they relate to you, and what is in your environment that you need to address. And here's a little hack for you. I thought about this last night when I was going through this and thinking about how do I keep this from becoming a bits and bytes discussion, because I've known to be wander into bits and bytes and talking IT lingo to folks that don't have a background in IT. And I want you to remember a little hack. It's very simple. It's 3 letters, C, I, and A. And this comes right off of the information security professionals little guidebook. C is for confidentiality or security. You know, it says keep your data confidential, keep your data secure. Integrity. This is assure that what affects the integrity of your data or the integrity of your transaction processing that your application systems are performing. A, availability. You know, is your data available when you need it? Is your processes, your applications available when you need them? That's ITGCs in a nutshell. These things work together, and I'll keep pounding away at that and giving you this kind of information. So if you look through the lens of CIA, you will see that what you are doing by building confidence in security, by building confidence in integrity and availability, addressing risks around that, you're also building the argument for reliance. So we got a lot of material to go through. Sit up straight, strap on your belts, put your helmets on, let's rock and roll and talk about risk management. All right, Steve, you want to start with risk management on the next slide? Thank you. When I look at risk management, I think of a management structure for IT. I think of a risk management program, and I think about managing my third-party vendors. Okay. If we look at this a little bit deeper, we are looking at, and I'll relate this to GLBA too, because we're going to start mixing and matching and being able to show you what's important. IT risk assessment and risk management is important to GLBA because it begins to flesh out some of the governance structure that's required by these regulations. Let's talk about having some level of a management steering committee or somebody in charge. GLBA talks about it as the person who is responsible for IT security. I look at it when I do my audits, I want to see that there's people who are responsible for leading IT security, whether that's a combined job of, let's say, your lead IT person or your CIO or your CISO or whatever you call them. This is somebody that thinks about security and risk management, thinks about your vision, your strategy, how it relates to how you process things, the data that you maintain on your systems, etc. It's also visibility. Having a management structure that reports up to the top of your organization, whether it's to your board of trustees or regents, or whether it's the chancellor or president of the university or such, that IT and in particular IT general controls are visible to them so that they understand what your risks are, what's the risk to your university organization, and what you need to do in order to manage those risks, in order to have good ITGCs and build reliance on your data and your processes. I want to be sure when I'm looking at IT risk management that there's some regular form of risk assessment being done. In other words, do you have a risk management program? It starts with a risk assessment. And let's relate it back to my little hack of CIA. You know, anything that adversely affects a C, an I, or an A, so if it affects confidentiality, in other words, if we break confidentiality or security, or it affects the integrity of the data or the integrity of the processing. And what I mean by integrity is I'm talking about its accuracy, its completeness aspects, to be sure. And anything that would prevent your data from being available to you when you need it are all risks that you need to build into your risk assessment and look at your environment and say, you know, what can happen? What can happen that would cause a lack of or cause an adverse effect to those three things? If you think of it in that way, you will always do a fairly complete job of risk assessment. Or you can have somebody come and do risk assessments for you. My recommendation here when I'm looking through this as an audit is I'd like to see these done at least once per year. You should stay on top of your risks because, quite frankly, folks, the technology changes faster than 18 months, which used to be the measure. The technology is changing, your organization is changing, the data is changing, and the regulations that you're being subjected to change all the time. So having the risk assessment adapt your control practices is a very good thing to do. The other piece of this is looking at your third-party vendors. You know, from my experience in working with higher education organizations, not a lot of you folks are building your applications from scratch anymore. You know, there's a lot of taking advantage of vendor software, whether you run it on premises or whether you take advantage of software as a service in the cloud. And on premises could be the cloud too, you know, just for my taste. But whether you're managing it and changing source code, or whether you're got your vendor up in the cloud as a service, these are things that need to be managed with them, and you need to understand what they are doing. It doesn't, as Steve has put it in the preamble, you know, it doesn't absolve you from accountability when you turn it over to third-party vendors. You're still accountable, and therefore you need to go and stick your nose into what's going on with them. What risks do they cause? What risks are they managing? You know, I see a lot of upfront, you know, due diligence that people do in choosing a vendor by running them through some sort of security questionnaires and that talk about what they do and how they manage, and they will tell you and respond to those. And what I see is that they're never touched again. You know, I pick my vendor, I trust my vendor. Don't trust your vendor. I trust my vendor, you know, to have the right level of security, to have the right level of ITGCs that would keep my data safe, provide for its integrity, and of course provide for its availability. Don't do that. Go ask questions. Go take a look. Talk to them. The other piece of it, and I think this is the bare minimum of vendor management, is get their SOC reports. So go ask them. They should have them. In this day and age, everybody has them because they've been asked many times. So by now, it seems to have become a matter of practice for your vendors, especially the ones that are hosting your data or providing you a service through an application, to have a SOC audit report. In this case, when we're talking about finance and financial statement data and reliance, we're looking for a SOC 1 type 2. So what does that mean? You know, talking in E's. This is one that takes a look at IDGCs from a supporting the financial statement perspective. And type 2 is the one where we actually have the auditors testing not just the design of the control, but also testing the effectiveness of the controls. So it gives you a very good feeling that the controls are in place and functioning. The one thing I would caution everyone on looking at a SOC report is, one, just remember, depending on the organization, this is a once a year snapshot of what's going on. You know, that looks backwards, and you're looking at it backwards. You're not looking at it forwards. So having discussions around risk assessment and risk management with your vendor is key when you're looking forward and looking to how they're responding to new and different challenges in their organization.
Hey, Earl, when you're getting those SOC reports from your vendors, which
Yes,
I agree we have to do, it's not why I received it and file it. People need to review them because there are deep inside the pages
absolutely
deficiencies that they will identify any deficiency that the vendor has.
You know, we could give a master's class on how to read a SOC report. In fact, I think we even have one of our folks put together some artificial intelligence to go read SOC reports, which is quite interesting, and contact us about using it. But one of the things is that you really need to not just look at the findings, the observations, and what they did about them, but you also need to read the context of the report. What is it on? But also, what are the controls that the vendor is expecting that you have in place in order to make their controls as effective as possible? So this may get into things like access security and managing the security on the hosted system, on the software as a service system in the cloud. You manage the security. Well, they expect you to have a process in place to be able to do that. And it will tell you all of the things that they want you to have in place. And you need to be sure that you actually put those in place in order for that to be effective. All right, next screen, my friend. Okay, now we're gonna really strap on. This is the meat of it. I will tell you the meat of GLBA and ITGCs. The intersection are the first three domains. It's risk management, it's access management and cybersecurity, and it's change management. Those are key, and we're going to spend most of the time with that. Yes, backups important. Yes, things in IT operations are important. But if you had to relate ITGCs to GLBA, the first three are what does it for me. Okay, so we're going to take a look at a lot of things. When I think about looking at access management and cybersecurity, I'm thinking about having policies, in other words, documenting the what, why, and where, and how I'm securing. I'm going to look at identity and access management. We're going to take a peek at user authentication, physical security, always fun. And then we're going to look at network and cybersecurity together as a whole, kind of move these around. I have these kind of separated in my audit plan, but it makes sense to talk about sensitive information first and how you protect it, and then cover network security as a whole. So let's start with policy. You know, policy establishes what needs to be secure and how. When I look at this, I want to make sure that not only do we have policy in place and that your policies are based on defining security from your risk assessment, but also that your policy is supported by standards and processes. You know, it's one thing to say, this is our policy. It's another thing to say, here's how we make it real. Okay, so yes, our policy says we use passwords to help authenticate. Well, okay, what's your standard for a password? You know, what does that mean? And this is key to having good security. So when I really look at it, I want to talk about, well, let's start with something simple like identity and access management. And these are the things that you're probably most familiar with. Identity and access management, while it's a fancy term, it really is, how do you provision access to your users, how you deprovision access when your users leave, and timely, and then account for changes. So what are you looking at? We're looking at giving them access. Nobody does a bad job of giving access. What I've seen is that there's a lot that's spent on making sure that people have a role in the organization and that there's access afforded to that role and it's mapped. And when they enter the organization, whether they're a student, faculty, or whether they're part of the operations of the university, they get what they need to do. We always say they get what they need to do their job, you know, and you say, job, what's the student's job? Well, their job is learning, their job is going to class, their job is responding to classroom applications, you know, doing research, writing papers, etc. So they need their space to be able to do that. They need space to be able to share among themselves in group chat and in group projects. Faculty, of course, they need the ability to do research and have places where they can store their research, what turns into intellectual property, etc. And then, of course, then there's the whole machinations around your donor applications, your ERPs, etc., depending on how many different systems you use to build up your financial data and process financial transactions. Deprovisioning, as Steve has mentioned before in the preamble, is one of the things that it seems to me sometimes becomes an afterthought, and we don't want it to be an afterthought. We want to do it timely. We want to take away that access, largely to prevent people from using their ID outside of, when they no longer should have access to it when they've left. But more importantly, to prevent others from trying to hack that ID and use it as a legitimate entrance into whatever access that person had. Changing is when people transfer from maybe one department to another or one activity to another. So you may be responsible for accounts payable today, tomorrow you're responsible for accounts receivable. I give you access based on your job need, but you are still covering certain elements of accounts payable, and this is how we accumulate access. So it becomes how much you travel around an organization is how much you end up having, and at some point in time we break things that we should be placing reliance on, so we break segregation of duties and we cause ourselves issues that way. We should always be managing this security using the least, I call it it's the least principle. It says it's just the right amount of security, it's just the right amount of access, that which a person needs to do whatever functions on the system that they particularly need to do. The last bit of identity and access management is what Steve alluded to in the preamble as well, is periodic user access reviews. Okay, so I'm going to use these terms and you're going to hear me, yes, I'm old. So this is the belt and suspenders control. This says if deprovisioning is broke or you're not managing changes and you're accumulating access at least once a year, if not a couple of times a year, you're going back and reviewing the access of every user and saying, is this really what they need to do? Is this really what they need to have in order to do their job? That is very key to make sure that you're accomplishing those in order to, just call it good security hygiene.
If the belt fails, you got the suspenders.
That's right. That's right. It's sad. I know that's a sad analogy, but it's the best I could do on short notice. Let's talk a little bit about user authentication, which is different from identity and access management. This is checking to make sure that the users who are they purport to be, you grant access to a particular person. That person is identified generally by a user ID or so that you've assigned to them. And then you need to be sure that when somebody is trying to log in or get access to your system, that they are that same user that you gave access to. How do we get at this? Well, in the olden days, we get at this through issuing passwords of a particular, construction, length and, types of characters and how many times you can guess it, and then whether that password expires periodically, and that's all very important as part of user authentication. We do look for that still, but I also want to be sure that I'm seeing things like multi-factor authentication. I want to build strength into who that user really is. I want to know that I want to prevent hackers from trying to just guess passwords or trying to just brute force your system. So we do simple things like the multi-factor authentication. So I give you my password and you send me a code over my, let's put it, I send me a code to my cell phone, a text message, SMS to me, and I have to enter in that code in order to gain access. That's, one multi-factor piece. Another one is when I'm trying to make sure that you're a humanoid and not a software program by a hacker trying to get at information on my system. I'll do the robot checking. I've seen some very interesting things, and you've seen the robot. I'm a human. Click. You've seen the ones that says, here's 10 pictures. Click on the picture that has the bridge in it. Click on the picture that has a car in it. Click on the picture that has a stoplight in it. Those are very effective as well. I saw one the other day. I think it made me laugh. I think it was Microsoft. I was, changing my Microsoft password or logging on to, and it says, it goes through its multi-factor authentication piece, and it says here's a picture, and you see two pictures. It says, if you look at the picture and orient the second picture the same way as the first picture. Okay, well, I have to describe this for you. The first picture is the butt end of a pig. The second picture is of a goat, and the goat's looking at you, or goat is crosswise, and you've got to take the little arrows and manipulate the goat. So now that you see a goat's butt and a pig's butt, and it made me laugh. Why they chose this, I do not know. Somebody has a sense of humor about this, but it's effective. It's effective because, you're not going to be able to get, at least for now, you're not going to be able to get someone other than a human to be able to respond to that. And that's the whole point. The other point about user authentication I want to make is, besides the password thing, is using passphrases as opposed to passwords. Make them very long. That's another effective way to keep people from brute forcing your system. And the other piece is that do not ever, ever, ever make a user use user IDs that are anonymized. Sysadmin, the name of the application, domain admin. Don't use those. We should make these accountable to people. So if you've got a bunch of support staff working in IT and they're using these powerful IDs like sysadmin to get around and do their job, don't do that. Give them sysadmin equivalent access so they can do their job. And so that builds up an accountability for who touched what and did what. And that's very important to know, especially from not only investigative purposes, but also it could be a forensic purpose as well. Okay, so we've beaten up user authentication. Let's talk briefly about physical security. Physical security, not yet.
I jumped the gun, sorry.
Not yet, we're working on it. I gotta keep moving. I gotta get my button gear. So physical security, very quickly. This is how we keep our file servers, our data centers, our file server rooms, our communications equipment. protect the access to it. I've seen a lot of organizations. I mean, look, some of these rooms are small. Some budgets are small. Not everybody's in a data center, has the ability to be in a data center with badge access and the like. Most often than not, I run across organizations with modest means that say, I asked this question of one university. It says, well, how do you keep they kept all their on-premises processing in server rooms. Well, how do you keep the server room secure? And it was, well, we have keys and door locks. And the auditor and me blanched. And I said, well, okay, that locks it, but you can't control keys. I can make a copy of a key. I can get in. I mean, what about your custodial staff? Hell, they probably have a master key to every lock in the building. So tell me, how do you know who accessed it? Even though you think you're limiting the keys, and that seems to be the risk. How do you know who came in and how do you know who left? And I was relating this story earlier to the folks in my organization, and I said, it was novel, and I give this guy kudos. They bought a Ring camera and they pointed it at the door about face focus level. And to be honest, when anybody unlocked the door and walked into the server room, the camera would pick up on them and would activate and would send an alert to their support staff, and they'd see who was accessing their server room or data center, and they could say, oh, that's Fred. Hey, Fred is down there doing something, that he needs to do IT support. Or they'll see somebody else come in who really shouldn't be in there, and they have a picture and they can relate and they can go deal with who's down there accessing their data center, and they can figure in their server rooms, and they can figure out the whys there. But what it gave them was two things. One, it gave them an alert that somebody was accessing it. That's good. And the other thing is, it gave them an audit trail that says this is the person at that time that accessed your room. So kudos to them. I wish it was my idea, but it was so simple and it was reasonably cheap. It was cheaper than putting in a whole badge accessing system to establish that kind of an accountability. Now let's talk a little bit about, we're going to go on to sensitive data. Let's make sensitive data protection very, very simple. Okay, encrypt, and if you have to remember anything, encrypt. Because you need to be able to keep that information secure. So it's one thing to allow access to it. It's certainly another thing to protect it. And while it may be secure within your application systems as you're processing it, it's certainly not secure sitting on the database at rest. And it's certainly not secure being sent in the clear across the network and to any interfaces that you're going through. So encrypt it at rest, encrypt it in transit, and keep it encrypted when you back it up. And you cannot go wrong, period. And I'll leave it at that. We can talk about a lot of other things with it, but that is what I look for in sensitive information protection. I'm looking to make sure that you've encrypted it. Now let's go on to, let's go on and talk about network security and cybersecurity. And again, going back to the CIA, right? Always make sure you keep your data confidential. Encryption does it. You want to have integrity to the data, encryption will help you keep it. So let's take a look at network. So this is what I'm looking for here is something that's very, very simple. I'm looking for controls over the perimeter. network that are in place. I'm looking to make sure that you understand what you need to protect. You understand the lines of, it's simple for me. Establish lines of defense, right? So you have define the lines of defense of your access points, whether that's to the internet through a firewall or to your servers or coming in remotely through a VPN or whatever. Establish that level of security over them. And you do this by having both a line of defense that's preventative in nature, and you have a line of defense that's detective in nature. On the preventative side, yes, I'm talking a firewall. I'm talking your user authentication measures. I'm talking about vulnerability scanning, and I'm talking about patching. And let me just say a couple of words about that. Vulnerability scanning is fantastic. It lets you know the holes in your system that are known. And if the vulnerability software knows about it, the hackers already have tried it or know about it. So these are the things that are known vulnerabilities. Some of it is smart enough to detect zero-day vulnerabilities. In other words, just came out. I'll call it the latest and greatest hack that just came out. But it's also very important then to also take and patch the vulnerabilities. These are one of the things that I'm looking at in all my organizations and all the audits that I do for ITGCs. Now I call out the patch management because, you know, there's two things that are that keep your systems weak, and that is what is well, we can talk about it when we talk about cyber. We'll talk a little bit about phishing and scams and stuff like that. But we'll also talk about unpatched systems. Look, these are known holes. They're well publicized. If there's a fix for it that Microsoft publishes every Tuesday, guess what? The hackers know how to exploit it. And if you haven't plugged the hole, you're going to get, somebody is going to take advantage of you at some point in time. I'll also tell you this much about patch management too. It's wonderful to do patch management, but you also need to be looking at your systems to make sure they're supported. I did a little analysis for a university just because they shared with me their operating systems and their assets, their servers and that. And I went through and I just said, okay, show me everything that's in support and show me everything that Microsoft no longer supports. And show me all the things that not only does Microsoft not support it, but they don't even provide security patches anymore. These are the ones you really worry about. Now, I know that operating systems will run forever. You know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of attitude because it costs money. But quite frankly, you need to be sure that your plans for security include upgrades that keep you on supported software so that you get these security patches and you can keep your keep your network secure. Detection. I want to talk a little bit about detection. This is intrusion detection software. There's software that is both intrusion detection and intrusion prevention. I think you need to be able to understand when a security event is occurring, when somebody is trying to exploit weaknesses in your system in order to gain access. Intrusion detection will be sending you alerts that somebody is trying to do something, whether it's internally and just as importantly, externally as well as just as importantly, internally, that you know that you have somebody on the inside trying to hack into something that they shouldn't be into. Responding to these alerts is key. Having the SIM technology, so that's the Security Incident and Event Monitor software. And then you can get some of these as freeware. I mean, I'm not talking about spending $1 billion just to secure your systems. I mean, we can get very practical and walk through freeware and open source that you can use that's perfectly fine to use, that you're able to get these things done. But you need the SIM technology in order to collate all of these alerts into something that makes sense so that you know what kind of event, whether it's a true attack or whatever. So we need to get that done. And I'm bumping up already, so we've only gotten through access. So I've got, this is hilarious because time check, 12 minutes. You're supposed to keep me honest. So we've been through penetration testing. Is another thing that you do as part of this cybersecurity. Make sure you're both doing it from the external side to the internal side in order to identify potential holes in your system. Make sure that you're responding to alerts. You're looking for where breach may have occurred. And the other piece of this is, of course, you need to be training your staff not only on breach, for the technical staff for IT support, but training your users on phishing scams that can occur, that they could be subject to. One of the things that it's going around now, and believe me, the hackers try all kinds of stuff, besides trying to get people to click on surreptitious websites, which really isn't the real website, but it really looks like the real website, to leave their confidential information in that and sensitive information. They're also pulling IT support scams where they'll get phone calls that says, "This is IT support. We need to access your laptop. Can you give me control over your laptop and give me your credentials so that I can log on in order to fix a quote-unquote problem that they try to get you to give them as if they need that in order to troubleshoot a problem. They don't, for the most part, unless they're working directly with you on a problem that you're having. Change management is another key element here that you need to look into. We won't go deeply into this at all because this has to do with making sure that you're documenting changes, that you're testing those changes, and that you're authorizing them to be moved into production once you have taken a look at the test results. And that as you move them into production, two things is that you have backup plans in case that particular change doesn't work, and that your users are actually in fact testing to make sure that the change is working the way it's expected in a post-production environment, in a post-deployment into production. Backup and recovery, just quickly as an ITGC, you should back things up. I think your risk assessment needs to identify how frequently your backup needs to be performed, where you're going to store it. I mean, 3 or 4 things just really quick off the bat. What you need to back up. The more frequently your data changes, the more frequently you should be backing up. The more you need to process on a 24/7 basis, the more you need to not only maybe back up the transactions, but provide for mirroring of the disk because it's that critical. Talk about secure storage concerns. With that, I talked about a little bit about having sure that sensitive data is encrypted. And then recoverability, my advice there when I look at it is testing. Recover your systems at least once a year to make sure that, one, you're creating the right backup that can recover the system, and making sure that the process you go through to recover that system actually in fact works. Lastly, for IT operations, interfaces are going to be key for financial systems. In today's world, we don't do a lot of file pushing. We do a lot through automated program interface, so APIs that establish a conduit between two applications or three applications or however many that push data. Make sure that you're looking for alerts on those that says the API has either failed or gone down, or it didn't in fact connect with the other systems, so it's dropping transactions instead of pushing them. And make sure that you have at least controls over it that will report on completeness and accuracy of that feed. And those are that gets us through IT general controls.
Grammage applies to institutions that handle student financial information. So Earl, why don't we jump into...
I'm going to jump to my safeguard slide.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay, so I will give you the 10-cent tour around this one. I have other slides in here that you may find useful, and we can get to those. Let's talk a little bit about, we've already covered through ITGCs, having somebody as a security coordinator or somebody up at the top responsible for security. That's part of IT risk management. Risk assessments are a requirement. We covered that as part of ITGCs in the risk assessment portion. As part of authentication and security, we talked about having a written security program. We talked about security monitoring and testing throughout ITGCs. We talked about the network. Security awareness and training, talked a little bit about that in cybersecurity. Vendor oversight as part of the IT risk management. We talked a little bit about change management. There's more to know about that. We can talk about that at some other date. Also monitoring and incident response. And then the last portion of it was also included in IT risk assessment, which is reporting up to the board. So there needs to be a coordinator, and there needs to be reporting, and there needs to be a program in place. So if you head to the next slide. Oh, back one. There we go. Okay, so here's my map. So I've mapped out the elements that you can go through in detail. The elements have it's a lot of regulatory ease, but I've tried to simplify it for you by saying, look, here's where you would find it in your IT general controls. We've already mapped it for you by building IT general controls and improving IT general controls and having your controls audited at least. You'll be able to gain some confidence in being able to comply with GLBA. And I am happy to help you with this. My audit program does do ITGCs, but I also do the mapping into the GLBA domains for you. And quite frankly, I think that's I think it's useful to you that we come and do something like that, and risk assessments and whatever help you need to be able to comply. So thank you for your attention this morning. I knew it would be tight.
It was tight.
I have more.
Part 2 to follow. So that was a lot of information. Here are some takeaways for you. Obviously, ITGCs are foundational. The GLBA aligns naturally with the ITGCs, and then strong governance builds resilience, transparency, and trust.
Again, thank you, Steve, Earl, for sharing your expertise. Really appreciate you being here as part of the forum for our group here. But I'm excited to turn things over to my favorite dance dad here, Matt Geerdes. Matt's going to talk us through the single audit changes here. So with that, Matt, I'll turn it over to you. Take us away.
Thanks, Anthony. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are situated here in the country. So as I was getting my thoughts together for this particular presentation and thinking about the single audit, and I acknowledge the fact that, the single audit, it is a very important thing. And obviously being the technical guru nerd that I am, it does kind of get my brain going. But I also know that, there are times it is just not all that entertaining. So I figured let's try to take the what we have to cover here, and let's do a creative little spin on it a little bit. So as you're going to be seeing, we're going to be talking about this from a bit of a dance perspective. And this is just something that just you don't associate the single audit with dancing, but why not, right? We're gonna have a little bit of fun with this. So as Anthony had alluded to, my name is Matt Geerdes. I am a principal within our local government services team, and I am one of the subject matter experts in the firm, specifically dealing with uniform guidance, dealing with compliance. But I also do audit work and consulting, and I am one of the subject matter experts dealing also with things from on the GASB side of the house. But I have also played a little bit on the FASB in my past life as well. I've been in practice now for almost 25 years, so kind of scary to think that, but that's just what it is. So my wife kind of jokes around saying after a while, when are you going to stop practicing and actually do this for real? Ha ha. So, and of course, my little twist on this is that I am a dance dad. My almost 14-year-old daughter does dance competitively. She does work in ballet, jazz, contemporary, hip hop, and you can definitely tell that she gets her skills not from me, because I have the epitome of 2 left feet. So with that, let's go in and talk a little bit about specifically how we're going to cover all the fun things for today. So first thing we're going to do is that we'll do it from the concept of, as I said, the dance lens. We'll do our warm-ups. So we'll do our stretching. We'll do some, kind of our introductions and kind of talk about this. The objectives of what we're going to be covering today are going to be threefold. We're going to be covering understanding what's changed and when it changed. What are the impacts for auditees and auditors? So those are our steps. So our classic steps and our new moves. As we've broken it down, of course, thinking about from the auditor's perspective, which, who's leading who on this one. So it's kind of it's interesting, obviously, with the auditor-auditee relationship. It is kind of a dance, because you're kind of going back and forth and you're going together in a synergetic relationship. So, of course, our final bow. And of course, our final objective, which I didn't mention, but I should, is, of course, making sure we're not tripping over ourselves, over the compliance thresholds, over how each side of the dance is working in unison. So let's go into our first section here. Let's talking about those classic steps, if you're thinking about it from the dance perspective. What was happening for auditees had to be thinking about from the year ended June 30th, 2025. And I know some of you have already filed your set, but there are still some single audits that are still happening from the 2025 cycle, and including some of those other ones also from the August 31st, September 30th, some of those year ends. Those engagements are still happening. So we do have some things to talk about here. So, all right. So the dance analogy is really, you can't start a tango until the music begins. And when you put that in perspective, what exactly we're talking about? Well, we're dealing with a compliance supplement. And needless to say, yeah, it was a little bit late to the party this year. So now the draft every year came out in the summer of 2025, a little bit later than it normally does. Normally, we're thinking about it. We see the drafts in the early part of the spring, and we're issuing the final of these things usually around May to June. So the draft came out kind of late. So and if recall, for some of you who don't know, the compliance supplement is a summary document that comes out annually by the OMB through the White House, and that has a listing of all of the main grants and federal awards that are passed through to by the federal government to either directly to institutions of higher education, or it may go through a third party, maybe a state board of higher ed, before it makes its way to your particular institution. And what happens is that document has in there links to the various compliance requirements by specific programs, such as student financial aid, R&D, et cetera. And then it also has tie-ins to the overall uniform guidance requirements for those compliance pieces. Now, that's why that document is so important. Essentially, it's the playbook that auditors need to understand, but it's also a very important source of information for auditees to really understand exactly, well, what exactly do I have to be doing as far as the uniform guidance. Most of your grant agreements will have a statement in there saying that you agree to comply with the requirements of the uniform guidance, but it doesn't list out the uniform guidance. So that's why this document is important, other than going to the UG itself. So this draft came out in summer of 2025, which we could use for planning and interim purposes, but the AICPA and the Government Audit Quality Center specifically said, you can't use this for the finals yet. We need the final compliance supplement before we can be issuing reports. And the final was released in November of 2025. It was like the day before Thanksgiving. So happy Thanksgiving, everybody. But at least we got that information. So now going forward, the OMB is trying to get it back to a more normal cadence. This is probably the first time I've ever seen it this particularly late, but so it is effective for fiscal years ending June 30th, 2025 and later. So, and it is required to be used. So you cannot use earlier versions for an FY25 audit, meaning you can't use the 24 compliance supplement for a fiscal 25 audit. That's not allowed. So, and if you, with the late timing of the release of the compliance supplement, a lot of entities are aware that, of course, that they have to file by the end of the year. And specifically, there's something called the data collection form. So that's basically the results of the audit per se, and it's filed with the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. Now that is still for these June 30th, 2025 fiscal year ends. Normally that's due March 31st, 2026, or 30 days after the report was issued, whichever is the earlier. And of course, if the filing is late, that is considered a finding, and then next year you are not considered a low-risk auditee when it comes to figuring out what the auditor has to test, which means there's going to be some more testing. So even though the compliance supplement was late, the data collection form due date was not extended, and we're not expecting it to be extended. Now, certain state requirements were extended. And the AICPA, specifically the Government Audit Quality Center, does have a listing of those states with specifically did have extensions. But you need to be in contact with your oversight agency to vet any of those extensions, just to double check this. So, and this is dealing just with the state ones too, not the federal ones. Again, federal requirements, they're still in play. In the higher ed space, two that I know specifically that are going to have some impacts are the New Mexico Office of State Auditor, the California Community College Chancellor's Office. Those entities did have state requirements that maybe a little bit shorter of a deadline that did get extended. State of Illinois, where I'm currently sitting, did not have any extensions from the Community College Board or the GATA from the State Board of Education, from the State Board. And essentially, the overall what we're trying to get across here is that if you haven't already, if you're expecting any sort of a delay or something's going to happen, is reach out and making sure you're communicating with your stakeholders. One, seeing if there's any extensions applicable. Assume not, but if they are, but then making sure you're having communications with the appropriate stakeholders, the board, any sort of bondholders that rely on your financial information for continuing disclosure requirements. That's important. Okay, now, Part 8 of the compliance supplement, and I did say Part 8 specifically, even though I know it says Part 2, it's a listing of all the changes that happened from the 25 supplement versus 24. it doesn't reflect any of the changes from 2025's draft to the 2025 final compliance supplement. Although amusingly, not much actually really changed other than a few formatting things and getting rid of the preliminary draft watermark when it went from the preliminary to the final. So now, part one talks to us about the effective date of the compliance supplement. Part two talks about the changes with the basic attributes that are effective here. So what I've got on the screen is an example in the compliance supplement that talks about the various types of compliance attributes. So they're grouped in categories. And each program that's listed in the supplement has items that are specifically applicable or ones that are specifically not applicable. In this case, I have got the student financial aid cluster. And as you can see on the screen, cash management as an overall compliance attribute is applicable. However, something like real property and equipment management attribute F is not applicable. So that's what we're talking about here. I'm not talking about some of those specifics. We're going to talk about some of those specific pieces within the attributes in a little bit. So the changes are the attributes. What we're talking about is items that either the Federal Oversight Agency either dropped or are adding to something that they want tested for compliance purposes. There is a 6 attribute maximum that they try to stick with. So that's kind of built into this. Now you could have certain federal programs that only have 2 or 3 of these attributes that are applicable, such as activities allowed, cash, and per period of performance, for example. So the changes that happened this year, for example, 10.558, which is the child and adult care food program that some institutions of higher education deal with, in the prior years, we had to specifically test cash management attributes in our single audits. We don't have to do that now. That attribute was dropped. So the guidance is dropped. It's no longer in the supplement itself. Now, the institution of higher education, you still have to follow the grant agreements when it comes to cash management, meaning any sort of reporting you have to deal with or requirements that are specifically labeled for cash management. You still have to do that. However, the auditor is not necessarily going to have to be looking at that as well. A couple other ones that had some changes as well within the higher ed space, 17605, which is dealing with the Native American employment and training, which is separate from WIA, the WIOA cluster, which didn't have any changes. And there were also some changes also as well in the CCDF cluster as well. A lot of the big common ones in higher ed, such as adult education basics, TRIO, HERF, Head Start, SFA, R&D, didn't have any sort of changes as far as adding or dropping a compliance supplement attribute. But I do, of course, always recommend look at part 2 to see if your program is not listed here and see what was impacted. So I just enlisted common ones that we've got here because this definitely cannot be all inclusive, because if you've ever seen the compliance supplement with just the programs that are in the supplement, it's over 2,000 some odd pages. Okay. So that's part 2. That's what changed. Now, when thinking about part 3, we're talking about our base compliance requirements. And these are linked to the compliance requirements of the uniform guidance. And it is applicable across all types of programs, assuming an attribute is applicable. So, there's something that gets baked into the compliance testing requirements, in addition to anything that's program specific in part 4, which we'll get to in a minute. So what happened this year is that the OMB created a part 3.1 and a part 3.2. And the reason why they did this is because of the fact that in 2024, we had uniform guidance revisions, and those revisions were taking into effect as of October 1st, 2024. So you had some grants in 2025 where the beginning of the grant was in 24. So you're going to be following grant section 3.2, but then you also have some grants that for let's say a June 30th fiscal year end and the grant program began July 1st, 2024, you're actually following 3.1 of these. So the old uniform guidance requirements. So we have this transition that's happening for this year, and it may show up next year, but I'm not quite sure. We'll see how that's going to play out. So that's what it is. So 3.1, that's the the uniform guidance requirements prior to the changeover. 3.2 is after the changeover. We're going to talk a little bit more on this, but if you go into the actual CFR itself, so the federal regulations, and you go on the website and you look for it, it's only reflecting that new CFR language. So, and something that I've got highlighted on here as well, it is possible to have a major program within the same single audit. So you could actually have, a major program where one major program is following 3.1 of the base requirements, but then the other major program is following 3.2 of the requirements. So you have to look at it on a grant by grant basis, and this is where it can get a little complicated for that, this fiscal year and possibly going into next year as well. So something to keep in mind on as far as making sure you're not tripping over these requirements. Okay, so what I've done on the next slide or so is some items in part 3, and specifically part 3.2. These are key items that higher eds are typically going to be interested in. So 3.2, when it came from the base requirements for allowable costs to the new requirements, some things didn't change, but some of the general criteria for allowability, one thing that did change was adding the fact that administrative closeout costs are now considered an allowable cost that can be charged to a grant, unless the grant specifically says you can't do it. So another piece of that as well is also there's a very large schedule of selected items of costs. It's an exhibit of items that specifically say, hey, that is allowable, or no, this is not allowable. Example, using the money on gambling, for example, is not an allowable cost. So that is in the, or if you're using alcohol. But if you're using it for, salary costs directly charged to the program for administration of the program, that's clearly an allowable cost. So that exhibit reflects that. There were some wording changes in the uniform guidance from 2024, the change that gets reflected here as well. Another thing that happened in here as well is the fact that that indirect cost rate for both requirements and those procedures, it was modified to include that the change in the rate that went up from the 10% to the 15% that's effective as of October 1st, 2024. We're going to talk about that a little bit. For equipment and real property management, couple of things changed in those base requirements. One, because the uniform guidance changed as well, the capitalization level for a capital, for basically equipment, is considered to be $10,000. That's a bump up from $5,000. Now, of course, something to be aware of. If your financial statement policies, it says that you call a capital asset 5,000, but the uniform guidance says it's 10, well, for your purposes, you're following 5,000. You have to use the more restrictive of those thresholds. Now, another thing that changed in here as well is the threshold for equipment disposal. So essentially, you're disposing of equipment and the cost of it, where it used to be 5,000, where there are no more further responsibilities, and it's gone. You don't have to worry about it anymore. That went up from $5,000 to $10,000 as well. And in the procurement, suspension, and debarment section, there were some changes in the wording to reflect the methods. For example, from going from the small purchases threshold to the simplified acquisitions threshold. So some of those wording changes flowed into this particular section of the compliance supplement. Okay, so that's the base requirements for part 3. Again, it's going to be applicable for all grants, and then you start going into part 4 and part 5, which is the specific things for your programs as well. So this is considered, includes some certain suggested audit procedures in some cases as well. Now, many of the programs had certain corrections to the, the CFR sections, but there were also some changes in the guidance specifically as well. Like in this case, we have got the student financial aid on the screen. Student financial aid did have some reference changes when it references something called the SAI. So this, the student aid index versus the old language, which was called the EFC, the expected family contribution. And there's also some items that are no longer required to be considered for testing purposes, like federal lien on loans. So that was something that changed as well. So that's what we're talking about with these specific pieces as well. So for student financial aid, since this is higher education, A couple of things changed. One, at the end of the day, after we were done, if we were done testing Pell and direct loans, there had to be a communication to the Department of Education regarding also within the findings as well, as far as what you sampled during the testing. Well, that requirement is gone. We don't have to do that anymore. So another interesting piece that happened as well is that when you look at the chart of eligibility items that has to be considered from the audit, it went from 32 items down to 26 items. And some of the things that came out are dealing with items like U.S. citizenship and a valid SSN, Title IV overpayments, loan defaults, property liens owned by the government, death of the guardian. A little interesting as well is because obviously the student financial aid handbook still needs to be consulted, because that's items you're going to be getting in, you're pulling on information on anyways, because you have to use that for administration of the program. Just from the audit purposes, we don't have to consider that anymore, which is a little interesting. Another thing that happened as well is that there were some changes in the language as far as the FAFSA Simplification Act as well. So, and again, as I mentioned, some of those eligibility items as well. 84408, which is the ALN for the Veterans Dependents for the Iraq and Afghanistan Service Grant as well. That all got rolled into Pell during this year. So it's not really considered a separate program within the supplement, even though the grant is technically still out there. So a couple of other things that changed as well within student financial aid is also looking at the removal of the monthly reconciliation programs for direct loans, as far as what we have to consider that as well. Now, institutions are still going to be monitoring this as well, to making sure that the programs are still within compliance requirements. We just as auditors, we don't have to test that anymore. So. So another thing that happened as well is also the removal of the special tests and provisions for Perkins loans, record keeping, and record retention, just because a lot of the Perkins loans, they're being liquidated, and just we don't have to consider that now specifically as well. There weren't any new special tests and provisions. But then again, as far as eligibility, there were some language updates. So when it comes to calculating cost of attendance, the supplement, this is supplemented with the student aid index, versus that expected family contribution as well. The other thing with the student aid index, something that was very interesting is that essentially it provided additional pathways for students to qualify for Pell. So for 2025, what we've seen so far is an uptick in the Pell Awards as more students are qualifying, and we do expect to see that continuing going into future periods as well, unless there's a change in the guidance. Okay. The R&D cluster is another one that's very common in the institution of higher education space. So what really changed here is that there was specific language in there talking about for NSF and NIH grants, basically saying that if it came from those federal award agencies, it meets certain criteria, it's automatically considered to be within the R&D cluster. So you have to consider that when it comes to what attributes you're going to be testing. And there were some wording changes specifically when it came to R&D and the activities allowed, allowable costs of recipients, special test provisions dealing with key personnel. There were some wording changes in that part of the cluster as well that gets taken into account. So those were some of the big common pieces that changed that I wanted to touch base on. Okay, another thing that happened in Part 8 is also talking about which of those grant programs are considered to be higher risk, meaning that we have to consider that a higher probability of being audited. So if you'll notice, I've got on the screen what was considered to be high risk from the 2025 supplement. Well, what's missing from 2024? Because there was a lot bigger list in 2024 versus 2025. Well, the biggest thing was that emergency rental assistance and the Corona state and local fiscal recovery funds for municipalities, that fell off. It is no longer considered to be a higher risk program. Now, we still have to consider if we have a grant program that is for COVID-19, you still have to put COVID-19 on the CFA and on data collection form. It has to be specifically flagged out. So that's still out there as well. Also, the HERF grant programs for higher education, it's still in the supplement because there are funds they had the obligation requirements, basically lapsing in the last audit cycle as well. And the amount that we audited in 2025 for HERF definitely did come down because most of those funds have been expected. And we're expecting a further decline as obligations and liquidation of those obligations are occurring for this as well. Now, why are we talking about higher risks? Now, auditees need to understand if their program is flagged as higher risk, it does have a higher probability of being audited. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. So, but you can have a type A program that is considered flagged as higher risk. It can still theoretically be lower risk. And of course, the auditor has to document it specifically. And that's dealing with if a grant program meets all the other criteria for a type A program, that's low risk. And then the amount for the Infrastructure Jobs Act funding is not considered material to the program. We've only got two of these things that are left. Basically, the Medicaid cluster, which the Medicaid cluster has been higher risk pretty much since I've been in practice. So I don't see any reason why it would ever come down. It's just something that the feds have flagged as higher risk and it has a higher probability of being audited. But that mine program that's on the grants, on the list as well as being higher risk, in all honesty, I have never particularly audited that program, so I'm not exactly sure what's in there, but I know higher ed institutions are more than likely not going to be able to deal with this particular program. So let's look at some of these new steps that are out there as well, dealing with some of these uniform guidance changes that's applicable for the June 30, 2026. And I use that as the primary benchmark just because that's a very common fiscal year end. So let's go through some of these new moves and things that are coming into play now. So, the first thing is we have some new grooves out there. The first thing is the de minimis indirect cost rate per the CFR. Previously it was 10%. So it's 10%, meaning that you can charge 10% of your modified indirect costs. You can charge that to the grant, assuming the grant allows you to charge indirect costs. Some grants specifically say, no, you can't do that, direct costs only. But if your grant does, then it was previously 10%. Now it's up to 15% and applies to those what's called the modified total direct costs. So, and it's applicable if you don't have a current negotiated indirect cost rate with the feds. Now, if you got one that's negotiated, that's it. You're stuck. You cannot use de minimis. So, but if you've never done it because you've never had a need to do it, you can use that de minimis cost rate, assuming the grant allows you to do it. You can't go back and say, no, I want to use it for old periods. You can't do that. It has to be, going forward on a prospective basis. Now, entities don't need to go out and get that negotiated cost if they don't want one. So just because you can get it, that's great. You don't need to get it if you don't go through. Just because of the fact that negotiating a cost rate, it takes time, it does take money, it takes expertise. It's not the easiest thing in the world to deal with. So so when you're thinking about modified total direct costs, I included a quick refresher on what's in and what's out. So again, the grant must permit charging indirect costs to the grant. So, certain grants allow you to do this, others don't. So those items that you can directly charge in here are items such as your salaries and wages, direct pay. That's part of your modified total direct costs. Benefits, supplies and services and travel. Subawards up to $50,000 for each subaward. The change from the old guidance to the new guidance is that threshold used to be $25,000. Now it's $50,000. So now, what's out? What is you cannot charge as part of your direct costs when you're thinking about what's indirect? So equipment, $10,000 or greater. Nope, can't do that. Capital expenditures, major building facility costs, patient care, something for higher eds, tuition waivers. That's not considered to be part of your modified total direct costs. You have to exclude that. So, and also any sort of scholarships and fellowships, you cannot charge that. That's not a modified total direct cost. You can't do that. So, and then any part of those subawards that's above our $50,000 threshold. So $50,000 of it can be charged as part of your calculations for your indirect costs. The part that's above $50,000, that's out. You have to scope that out. Okay, Another major change it's happening now, as far as the uniform guidance is that the procurement, there have been some changes in the language for procurements, and there's also been a change in also the thresholds as well. So the simplified acquisition threshold, the SAT, that's what was formerly called the small purchase threshold. It went from $150,000 at max to $250,000. And for purchases that it's between that micro purchase threshold, that didn't change, which the micro purchase threshold actually did change, excuse me. So it used to be 3,500. Now it's up to 10,000. And in some cases, you can self-certify up to 50,000 for that threshold. So essentially what's happening is that if you're purchasing between the micro purchase and the simplified acquisition threshold, you can basically just follow the simplified procedures, and you have to reasonably consider supplies and services with a couple of things to think about. Meaning you don't have to go out for formal bids for these things. You have to get a defined scope of work and set evaluation criteria, given preference to small businesses, price reductions, market research through reviewing government advantage, getting quotations. So you've got a couple of ways to research to get the best price, but you don't necessarily have to go out to bid. Now, if you are above what used to be called small purchase, and that used to be 150, now it's 250 under the SAT, then you have to go out for formal bids. That has not changed as well. So it's also baked into the fact that the increase for equipment went from 5,000 to 10,000 as well. Those other pieces that I talked about from the procurement suspension and debarment, that's also reflected in the uniform guidance as well. And we did have a question here. I want to take a look at it because these are usually good. Oh, here's a good one. Once your negotiated indirect cost rate expires, can you use the de minimis rate and not negotiate a rate again? If you're just going to let it expire and then you are not going to go out there and use it again, then yes, you can go down and use the de minimis cost rate as well. So I have to admit, I haven't seen a lot of that in practice, just because typically once an entity goes through and does the negotiated cost rate, they're going to try to negotiate it again to get that rate to go up a little bit more as well. So typically, most entities are going to try to keep that rate because it's usually a little bit bigger than the de minimis rate. But if you've lapsed it and let it expired, then you theoretically can use that rate as well. So, okay. So a couple of other changes what happened in the uniform guidance. First thing is talking about pre-award impacts. So there's a couple of things that have to happen on the uniform guidance you have to think about. One, there needs to be updated policies for fixed amount awards to clarify certain costs that are applying to the budget. So you got to make sure that your policies are reflecting this as well. And there are also changes as far as your record retention and access requirements that are applicable as well. That's also changed in the uniform guidance as well. There's some reinforcements on engaging communities during the program and during the program development, meaning getting community input to make sure you're going to develop the program before you actually get the award and how you're going to execute it as well. The notice of funding opportunity, there are some changes in the language that emphasizes clear, plain language, clearly communicating those requirements, identifying those eligible applicants, and a summary as well. And also being able to provide some technical assistance to inexperienced applicants as well. That's something that was baked into the uniform guidance. And there's also some emphasize the diversity of reviewers in any sort of merit review panel of an application as well. And then there's also items dealing with whistleblower protections and making sure that in the uniform guidance, there's specific items to give the whistleblower protections legal protection as well. Okay, so post-award impacts. These are some changes in the uniform guidance. Now, when we say post-award, that doesn't mean the program is done. We're talking about after the initial award has been granted, and this is really focusing on how the entity executes the program. And some of these things are going to look a little bit familiar as we've already talked about them. So one, this first one, which I cannot stress enough, recipient, subrecipient must establish, document, maintain effective internal controls over the federal award for reasonable assurance that the recipient and subrecipient is managing the award in compliance with the statutes, regulations, and terms and conditions. Steve had mentioned specifically he doesn't like to read pieces of slides. I try not to do that either, but that one is so important, especially considering if you look at an auditor's report, we are specifically looking and assessing the internal control, and we are testing it as well. We're not opining on it, but we are testing it. So something else that kind of goes back in what Steve and Earl were talking about is reasonable cybersecurity and other measures to safeguard personally identifiable information. That's another important thing that has to be baked into what these need to be doing as far as they're executing their program. So not only is it just good practice, if you're with federal awards, it's required. Now, a couple other changes with equipment is that there's some additional guidance talking about the meaning of what's called conditional title, meaning you kind of own it, but you don't own it. There are some changes that I mentioned before regarding Indian tribes and disposing of equipment with tribal law. And then, of course, that threshold from 5,000 to 10,000. We've talked about that as well. Now, again, equipment is defined as tangible personal property, useful life of more than a year. And in this case, up to $10,000 is the value of that. Again, and if you go back into the 200-201, there's other definitions about capital assets, including the applicability of things like computing devices, general purpose equipment, IT, special purpose equipment, and other types of supplies that could be considered equipment. Now, another change that happened in here is something that I want to talk about specifically, is enhancing the language when it comes to what is a subrecipient versus what's a contractor. And this is actually a fairly common question that I get in practice is, well, what is it? So, well, specifically at the bottom of the screen, you can see is how, 2 CFR 331, there were some changes in the language in here and talking about how the pass-through entity is responsible for making those determinations on whether the entity that's getting the awards, they have to make the call that a subrecipient or a contractor. So if you're passing through your funds, you're the one that's got to make that call. So obviously you can reach out and work with the federal oversight entity to help with that, but ultimately you're responsible because the federal agencies don't have that direct legal relationship with those contractors or those subrecipients. So, and again, the other thing as well is that there can be other indicative characteristics of a subrecipient versus a contractor, and it's not limited to what's on the uniform guidance. It kind of goes back to something actually the GASB is doing specifically, where certain of their items, they say items that include but not limited to. The GASB's been doing this. The FASB does this in some of their areas of their accounting guidance. So uniform guidance is kind of helping with that as well. So, the big overarching characteristics is just those subrecipients, who's eligible to make the call and make determinations and programmatic decisions versus a contractor where you're just providing the goods and the services and you're not subject to the uniform guidance per se. So you're just providing the services because you're getting paid for it. So you're not making any other decisions. Okay, how are we doing on time? I think we're doing all right, actually. Good. Okay, so next thing we're going to talk about is some of those auditor considerations and things that we don't want the auditors to be in the room to be tripping up on. But of course, auditees, if auditors are being tripped up, they're going to, trip and fall over and knock the auditees down too. So again, who's leading who? So let's talk about that. So, the beat has changed when it comes to this as well, and you have to adjust your choreography. Now, the first thing is that the threshold for a single audit did change. And essentially what's happening is that when you even need a single audit, you're looking at your federal expenditures, so federal expense. We're not looking at revenues. So we are looking specifically, up through the fiscal year ended 8/31/2025, you're following the old guidance, $750,000. I did see a couple of engagement teams, and I've seen some items where they tried to use the $1 million threshold. You cannot do that. You have to wait until a 9/30 fiscal year end or later. So that's where those, those 6/30/2026, the threshold's bumping up to $1 million to trigger the need for a single audit. I doubt that we're going to have a lot of institutions of higher education on the not-for-profit or governmental side are going to run into this issue just because typically the student financial aid cluster is really big, typically, and it usually triggers this as well. And for some institutions of higher education, between student financial aid, R&D, TRIO, this is not going to change anything. So it's really those smaller entities that are going to be, possibly dealing with how this impacts. Now, another thing that's going to change here that will impact higher ed institutions is those thresholds of what's a type A program versus a type B program. And type A versus type B is something in the audit space that we need to be thinking about to figure out, do we need to audit a program or do we can just pass on it on certain thresholds? So, that type A threshold used to be $750,000. It was the same thing that we had for our single audit triggering threshold. So they were one and the same. Now it's up to $1 million. So the new threshold bumped up, the type A threshold up there as well. Now, during a single audit, we have to be doing planning as far as risk assessment. So that's why all these thresholds come into play as far as type A's and type B's. One of the things we need to think about is our low risk auditee, which is if you're auditing a low risk auditee, you only have to audit 20% of the federal program. So maybe just 1 to 2 major programs, depending on how big your institution is. A not a low risk auditee, you got to go up to 40%. Now, if you pick a program and it's 80% of the CFA, you don't have to audit 20%. You just audit that particular program as well. Some of the other thresholds that changed around that impact some of the larger institutions of higher education is that, that threshold for $750,000 was up to, if you had federal awards, up to $25 million. Well, if that threshold is now for $1 million, is actually bumped up to $34 million. And now, so what's going to happen is that these thresholds, figuring out how big your programs are, that's all going to kind of increase over time. So there really weren't any other changes. If you had Tier 3, which is your programs are 100 million to $1 billion, that threshold is still $3 million for a type A. And then if you have over $1 billion in federal awards, there are no changes in those higher. I'm not expecting to see that, but that it's out there. So now, once we've determined what we consider to be a type A program, and actually I'm going to jump back just for a second. So got ahead of myself. So when we think about low risk auditing, what is it we have to think about? One, frequency of single audits. Higher education institutions are going to have single audits every year. So that's usually not going to be an issue. It's timeliness of filing, what's in the audit opinion, making sure that we're talking about that, those financial statements are GAAP compliant. We didn't have any past findings that are material weaknesses. We don't have going concern. We don't have anything late filing. So that's important when we think about our type A's and type B's. Our low risk and not low risk, which flows into type A's and type B's for the quantities. So now, once we figure out our audit risk and we figure out the type A's and the type B's, now what is the type A's and what are the type B programs? Then we actually have to do a little bit of work on those risk assessments. So anything at the type A program, we have to risk assess as auditors. No ifs, ands, or buts. You have to go through it. And one of the things couple of things you consider is that, again, you're looking at frequency. Has that program been audited in the last 2 years? Were there any findings? Was it designated, basically Medicaid, was it designated as higher risk? Were there any known fraud, question costs? If it's a high risk type A, we have to audit that program. If it's not a high risk type A, we may not necessarily have to do it, but we're not done yet. So if the audit coverage has been met, you don't have to do any sort of work with those type A's, assuming that you've risk assessed all your type A's and they're high risk. Then you're done. You don't have to worry about the B's. But then when you do the B's, then you're going to be looking at it, and you actually have to audit up to a certain, risk assess up to a certain percentage, and possibly replace some of those type B programs with the type A's. So this is why that threshold increase is important. It's going to cause some of these programs to fall off from type A. It may fall down to type B. We may not have to risk assess it, and we may get the chance to rotate it out. So, all right, and the type B threshold, it's 25% of the type A threshold. So Originally, the threshold was 750,000. 25% of that is, a 187.5. But now we're up to just 25% of $1 million, so $250,000. The large loan program, that's part of the process per se, that has not changed. So that's when we're looking at loan programs, and the loan makes up 50% of the program, student financial aid being an example, then you have to think about that program, pull it out, and you essentially are going to be calculating the type A without those programs as well. That's more an auditor consideration, but that's for the auditees, just for your information. So, okay, we've talked about items that the auditors have to think about. And another thing that auditors have to do, which I know we don't like these, but auditors don't like to write findings, and recipients obviously don't like to look at them and deal with them. They are part of the process. So now the uniform guidance did make a couple of tweaks to items within the findings, specifically what's considered a question cost. So the finding language was tweaked to make sure that we are reporting the dollar amount of known question costs. If we can't determine what it is, we have to specifically put in our why we can't do that. So, and then also when it comes to how known costs were computed, we actually have to incorporate that language within the finding as well. In some case, it's a known finding based on, let's say, a invoice. That's usually pretty easy language to include in the disclosures. So, but that is required now. So, and the definitions that I've got here on the screen is, the definition updated of a question costs under the CFR as well. And there were a little bit of wording massages here, but essentially what we've always considered to be findings, that really is not changing as well. And something else is very specific here is that if you have a deficiency in internal control that has to be reported, that doesn't mean you have question costs. It just means that the control is not effective and is not conducive for making sure that you are preventing non-compliance. So again, if you have a deficiency in internal control, you may not necessarily have a question cost. Now, you can still have findings, of course, that are both a deficiency in internal control and non-compliance. And the question cost could be related to that specific non-compliance that was identified in the audit. So a couple other things that we have to include. This should look fairly familiar as well. The federal program, the criteria is not being followed. What was the issue? Why it happened as well? What's the impact? And then what's the question cost and how they were computed? That last little item at the bottom is something where if we can't determine it, we have to put a description on why, and otherwise why it couldn't otherwise be reported as well. So that's the change that's happened here. And then, of course, the context. This is something where I see some issues on occasion, as well as additional information to provide perspective regarding essentially how big this is, meaning an isolated incident, or was it a systematic problem? What's happening? And you can also identify instances must be related to the universe in some cases, and the cases examined to kind of give you a little bit more information. You don't have to go into, like, in some cases where it's appropriate. There's also, if you're doing statistical sampling as well, you have to disclose, indicate whether or not a sample was considered to be a statistically valid sample as well. Something that I also do see some items where it gets missed is that if a finding was remedially in the prior period and it's a repeat finding, you have to flag in the current year's finding that it is a repeat. So, of course, the recommendation, the views of the auditor, the auditee's officials, and the corrective action plan as well. The corrective action plan, of course, it does have specific requirements, and then it's on a separate letterhead, and the auditor is going to typically disclaim their opinion on the corrective action plan because that's really owned by management as well. Now, almost done. So one more thing we talked about, and it kind of ties back into what Earl and Steve were talking about, and that's dealing with cybersecurity provisions as well. Obviously, there are requirements to have internal controls in here, but there are specific items when it talks about reasonable cybersecurity to protect PII, which I've got here in text right here. and it provided a framework for adopting the measures. But interestingly enough, the OMB didn't actually adopt a specific framework. So it's saying that, the oversight agency can provide guidance, but the OMB is not providing specific here. So there could be a government-wide framework over time, but right now the federal agencies are providing more specific guidance at their own discretion right now. Now, this is not the same as GLBA. That's something that's very specific for compliance. It still has to be considered for those in the SFA space, but it works in tandem and along those same lines. With that, so don't see any other questions that have come through on this. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your attention, and hopefully you got something out of this as well. My contact information is on the screen, as well as my LinkedIn profile if you want to hit me up for a question or a comment. So Anthony, if you want to take it from here, I think I got to jump to the next slide, right?
Yep, all good. So thank you, Matt. And thank you to Matt and Steve and Earl for the presentations today. Wealth of information shared as part of the session, and looking forward to being able to continue that with you tomorrow. Tomorrow's topics will be covering AI in finance and operations, as well as the often imitated, but never truly duplicated GASB update for you as well there. So excited to have you join us back tomorrow if your schedules allow for that. Quick reminder for you today as we wrap things up, please do complete the survey that will be prompted as you exit the GoTo platform for the webinar today. And again, on for tomorrow morning, same time, 9:30 Central. As we noted in the chat, you can access the handout section for any of the materials today. If you do have questions on anything that was covered, both in Steve and Earl's session or in Matt's second session here, do encourage you to reach out to any of us. We're happy to answer questions and continue the dialogue. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap up day one of the forum. Thank you again for your time and your attention. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thanks.